the Age of Fission radio show with your host, Lonnie Clark. We stand together and accept that we now live in a world transformed by Fukushima. From 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time here on UCY.TV radio. We relentlessly engage every ear that listens. We expose and confront the complete lack of accountability for the nuclear industry. Consider social engineering programs who view our bodies, minds, and souls as assets on a balance sheet. We discuss vital current issues, interview activists, and engage our audience in an effort to allow all voices to be heard. The Age of Vision radio show creates a venue that all will choose. We encourage our listeners to reclaim their power and their courage to take action and save our planet from the ravages of greed and indifference. Our actions matter. Every voice matters. We remind our listeners that happiness is resistance. Love is greater than fear. Good morning, UCY.TV radio listeners. This is Lonnie Clark with the Age of Fission radio show. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate you sharing our station with your friends and family. We always appreciate new listeners and new subscribers to our YouTube channel. This morning, we have for you a pre-recorded interview conducted by Jana Thrift of KEPW.org. She is the producer of Water is Life. She was interviewing a Northwest activist, Louisa Hamachek, and gave me permission to re-air her interview here for our listeners. I hope you enjoy this interview as much as I did. We are the show Water is Life, and today we have Louisa Hamachek here, and it's pretty exciting to have her on this show because she's been a big inspiration for me. You know, a lot of the different things that I do in life, she laid seeds way back when, one of them being my interest in media, which led to me being part of this radio station. So that's kind of cool. And the other thing about Louisa that's really super special is her love for water. And she definitely created kind of a contagious energy about that. You know, it was downright contagious, her love for water and the way she shared her love for water through teaching kids and teaching me and teaching my kids. and we had a lot of beautiful years, you know, so I guess she lives more in Portland these days, so I don't get to see her nearly as much. And I'm just excited to have her here on the show. So say hi and...
Hi. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah,
and
welcome.
to see you again, Jana.
Welcome. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about, you know, how did this love for water grow for you, you know? Do you have any, like, roots that kind of started the process of you feeling so connected to water?
I grew up in New England, and we had a farm up in the hills, in the Berkshire Hills of Massachusetts, and up from us, I'd go riding every day, and the trails would go up to the Taconic Ridge top, and they'd follow the streams, and I ended up with my high school boyfriend building a cabin in the woods right near a stream. And so that time period, it really began where I just loved the peacefulness of being next to a trickling stream. And life all happens there, and it was really peaceful to kind of find myself as a young adult leaving my parents' house and going into the woods to my shack that I made. And so, I don't know, the sound of the water was just so beautiful. And so I can think that that's where it began, after school riding with my horse up the stream beds and stuff.
What inspired you to do the incredible things that you do teaching kids about watersheds?
Well, I was in Chicago living there when I also wanted to always escape from being in the city. And so about 22 miles due west of downtown Chicago, you can feel yourself at this arboretum. And I would zip out there and sleep in my car sometimes. And one morning, the staff at the Arboretum found me there, and I was actually sleeping in a whole bunch of popcorn inside my car because it was winter and it was cold. And on the way, I got this garbage bag of popcorn dumpstered from behind a movie theater for insulation. So I opened my door, and all this popcorn falls out in me, too. And so it was kind of a funny scene. But it made for me getting to be friends with the people at the Arboretum who came in early in the morning wondering if I was okay. And I thought that was very nice. And so then it turned into about a month later, I was teaching a watershed workshop there because I was trying to think of something I could do to be part of the Arboretum. And I just thought it up instantly about making a clay map with kids in their kid program of the Arboretum's streams and how they make their way to the creek nearby there. And so that worked. So that was the first time, and it gave me an excuse, and I realized it's really fun, and kids catch on to it very well, and it makes them feel good. And it ended up over here 10 years later or something. I started doing it over here in this town. It happened one day, and I did it for the Forest Service at the Salila Festival down at the coast in Reedsport. And they paid me $100, and I thought it up, and all of a sudden I was doing it. And then some gal found me there who was scouting around for teachers of after-school programs in Sweet Home. And so she hired me to do it for the 7 elementary schools in Sweet Home. And I taught it in workshops in all those classrooms, every one of them, and then also in the after-school program. And so it became this like easy thing using potter's clay of making a model of the lay of the land of where the kids live. And I do the easy one first and then come back 2 weeks later. So the easy one would be the jet's eye view of the Willamette River between the Cascades and the Coast Range and how it bonks into the Columbia River in Portland, and shortly it all pours into the ocean, and then you have a coast. So only about 5 different things you need to stick into that. And the fun one on that is you can put a mountain up at the top of where the Willamette comes into Portland, and across the river you stick a little mountain, and when the kids can tell you what that mountain is, and what the city is that's at the top of the map there where it comes in, and they guess that it's Portland, then they can stick their thumb into the mountain that's on the other side of that and make a hole, and we pour in vinegar and baking soda and explode the mountain, and it's Mount St. Helens. And that pours down and into the groove that they made, that's the Columbia that goes to the ocean. And so that's pretty cool. I give them a printed picture of a simplified map of that one that they just did of the lay of the land, and then I zoom in on 10 to 20 miles around the town, and so I find what is the simple pattern of the rivers that are nearby there and the lakes, and I simplify it down, give them that, send them home, say I'll be back in 2 weeks, and if any of them can give me the names of any of the hills or the creeks that they know of, and they should show it to their families and their uncles and everybody, all the fishermen and people in the family. So then we compile them, and I would have gone to the town and gotten the city official maps of the town and bring them all there the next time. And we then create a map of the town, and any creeks that haven't been named or hills, we let the kids name them. And write them into the map and turn it back to the city, so from there on they name them after their cat or their own name, or Jimmy's Creek or something like that. Anyways, and so they really begin to own it more and more by creating a model, and by looking at a map and putting a dot where they live, they start to say this is where they live in a watershed, and Joey lives in the other stream, and you have to go over this hill because between every 2 creeks is a hill, and between every 2 hills is a creek.
I love it.
Yeah, and it's a simple thing that is a formula that works, except for when you go to Eastern Oregon and nothing goes to the ocean. It just goes into very salty lakes like Lake Aber and that stuff out there. So that's a different story. But usually you can always tell the kids that you pour your cup of water on the ground and it'll find its way to the ocean. and they are fascinated, and then you show them one little creek leads to another, and it'll be obvious. And what most kids haven't seen is, or they don't even know, because they get in the car, they drive to school, they wake up at school, and they go, oh, and then they get in the school bus or something and go home, and there's so many other things to pay attention to rather than the creek that the road went alongside. But almost always roads are built alongside the creeks in the valleys, and they pour in one direction or the other, and going down will go to the bigger and bigger towns as well as the bigger and bigger rivers, and where two rivers connect will always be a town, almost, unless there's some reason not to, because that was where the trading went on in the old days. Of people would come downriver and upriver to where the two connect, and then they trade their goods with each other. So you don't have to get lost anymore when you get this sense of the watershed. You always know if you're up on a mountain and you're finding yourself lost, you just follow a creek and it'll get to a town.
Oh, I like that. You know, I never really considered that myself, but that makes perfect sense.
Gives courage and bravery and a sense of being in the world to kids. It's really pretty cool, and to anybody, actually, when they get a sense of where they live.
I love that. I mean, I love the idea of them being able to locate, this is where I'm at, personally, and then all of a sudden, everything kind of becomes a much more personal experience, it seems like.
And I would do this thing of putting up various kinds of maps in the room and call it geography class, so all the straight people in the town like me. But I did teach the kids how to look at maps and how to read maps and to find themselves different sorts. And I found that National Geographic map of the lights of North America at night, the map of America at night that was just a photograph from a satellite, it shows the cities as these lit up things, but it also is very simplified, and you see where the towns are, and then you also see the lakes, and for some reason the lakes are reflected or something like that. At any rate, there's a very simple picture of any of the lakes, and next to Sweet Home is Green Peter Lake along the South Fork, I think, of the Santiam River, the South Fork, South Santiam. Any rate, they put a dam there where three creeks came together, and it looks like a chicken foot from a satellite picture of North America, and you can find Sweet Home to the left side of the chicken foot. And I could say, okay, somewheres to this side of the Rockies is the other range, the Cascades, and we live on the side of the Cascades, and Sweet Home's on the left side of the Cascades, the west side. And somewheres will be a chicken foot. And they're looking at a map of all of this North American continent, and they find where they live by that chicken foot. And then we know each of the fingers of the chicken foot is a different creek we can give a name to, Foster Creek and Green Peter Creek and stuff like that. And then we just draw it right to their town, and they live there, and they can see where they are in the world, the whole world. And really, you get juvenile delinquent troublemaker kids that everybody, all the rest of the after-school program ladies, they go off and they get a coffee and they stand off on the side and they don't want to do anything. And that's good, because that leaves me with the kids. And I can influence them to being nature lovers and to feeling like they're part of that part of the world.
I love that. I mean, that was one of my favorite parts of the Watery World workshop that you did here at Earth Day for years here in Eugene, was the maps. And one of my favorite parts is when you pull out the mister bottle and you miss the top of those mountains. Oh, yeah. And it's just so obvious how the watersheds all work, and the water makes it to the ocean, and it's just a very graphic and easily understandable way to see how that whole process works in your very own area.
Yeah. And that one that we did at the Watery World at Earth Day, Eugene, for years, that would be a huge one, the festival-sized map that would be sometimes 4 feet by 4 feet. I did that at the Salmon Festival in Portland a few times, did it at the Salila Festival, where you do a big one and you have two kids on each side sitting on milk crates, and you do this low on the ground on a milk crate, and you let each kid be in charge of a certain quarter of the map or a part of the map, and you have a simplified, bigger thing. That one is really fun when you've gotten it all done. It takes a few hours to get that big one done, quite a few hours. By the end of the day, it's done. So by the end of the day, you give a squirt bottle to every kid and tell them to squirt on the mountains. And it's so much fun, and you missed it. and it is just a mist that comes, and then they're squeezing away, and at a certain point those little mist droplets touch each other and become a bigger drop, and at a certain point one more bit of mist droplet hits it, and it can't contain itself, and gurgling down it goes, down the little streams that they made out of the globs of clay from off of topo maps and this and that. And the other thing is, then they start following it with their finger to smooth the rivers and the creeks so that they flow better and get the globs out, and they feel it. They feel what gravity does going down. They feel it with their finger dropping over little hills and coming down to the foothills and then down into the flat valley. And then, so they can just like learn something in a whole different way.
Yeah, it's such a tactile, I mean, it's like learning through all of your senses. I mean, the touch, the sense of touch, being a part of that experience of finding that smooth path for the river.
Yeah.
That sounds
and helping it go on its way to the sea.
Yeah. It's such a neat project. So I guess, I mean, you know, moving from the way that you have been able to connect with kids in just the love for nature and the map making. I mean, the map making is amazing, by the way, Louisa. If nobody has seen one of Louisa's maps, they're missing out on something in life, I tell you. It's like the old-fashioned cartographer experience instead of, you know, I think what we see on maps these days is something that's clearly made by a machine compared to this beautiful map. Speaking of which, Louisa gifted KEPW with this incredibly beautiful Willamette Valley map, and it's on fabric, and it's done as a screen print, and it's just
hung from a beaver stick.
Thank you. We get the real picture here of how beautiful this map is, and I did not understand the art of map making until I met you. I mean, honestly, I mean, it's definitely an art of its own. You have made it into an art.
I'm very excited about the next one I'm doing right now, which is the whole Pacific Northwest, which is the whole Northwest, which includes up to Alaska, and the Yukon and the Fraser River and the Columbia River, the three biggies of this area. To simplify it down to that is going to be so exciting of how, I mean, like the Columbia River is so funny and how it begins. It's like confused. It does a spiral out of the Rocky Mountains, and it goes down and up and down until finally it's crossing out of Canada down into the Columbia Plateau and the Columbia Basin around Spokane, kind of up over there. Then it comes into America. But meanwhile, it's done a spiral up in Canada before it even gets to us, up in the Rockies, until it's figured out how to get here. And then it comes down around Hanford, whips around the apples growing of Wenatchee and stuff, comes down through Hanford. Nuclear crap, which is leaking into our Columbia River from nuclear waste, which could, at any time, the nuclear power plant that is still there, the Columbia Generating Station, could have a dreadful accident, as it has at least one accident a year, or it's shut down for a malfunction at least every year, if not twice a year, and then it would go right into there. And in the old days, in the 60s, when they were cranking out bombs out of Hanford, nuclear bombs, they were making plutonium out of 7 nuclear reactors, and they let the Columbia go right through the reactors to cool the stuff, which radioactivized the water that went right past the reactor cores. It cooled it that way. They didn't have a secondary cooling system. I don't know when they realized that they ought to do that.
Oh, my goodness.
But, yeah, and how many hundreds of miles is it before it gets to the ocean in Astoria? Having gone down past Hood River, 10 miles south of the nuclear facility of Hanford is the Tri-Cities of 250,000 people in Richland, Pasco, and Kennewick. Then it bends around there and it heads past Hood River and it goes to Portland, and then past Portland and it gets to Astoria at the ocean. And there was a clam factory, and there was a worker at Hanford in the 60s who, when he was leaving his badgeometer that says how much radiation your body has soaked up for the day, and at the end of the day his badgeometer was all filled up with radiation, and they said, "What's going on here? You step aside." And they Geiger countered his body and found that his tummy was radioactive, and they asked what he had for lunch, and it was clams from Astoria, from a can.
Crazy.
But everybody else eats those clams, but nobody else gets radioactive testing.
Right.
And everybody else ate them. And it went all the way down the Columbia to the clams in the estuary.
Wow. I mean, one of the things that I learned on the trip that I went with you on the Veterans for Peace bus up there to Hanford during one of the hearings, I was just floored to hear that basically they were using really dirty plutonium. I mean, it's not just that they had, uranium and plutonium. These poisons are bad enough on themselves, but in particular, they were so inexperienced in the way they were creating those bombs that the waste that they've created, particularly at Hanford, is like really super yucky because it's very impure. Like, it's not pure this or pure that. It's got a lot of garbage in there that makes it a little more scary even to deal with than the normal things that are problematic about dealing with things that are poisonous that last for the life of the universe.
Yeah. Right. Well, yeah, and they were gung-ho on finding new bombs and new things that they could make, and they let these cowboy scientists get to the middle of Hanford to the 300 area or something where they tested out stuff. And then they just let it soak into the ground. And they messed around with all kinds of experiments. And then just like they soaked into the ground. And they went into the ground. And they said that the nuclear waste would take 1,000 years to reach the Columbia, and it took it 40 years. And it just went to underground water moving systems, and it moved. And they were so far off on their idea of how fast it went.
It reminds me of climate change.
Yeah.
Everybody's like, oh, well, actually, things are going to compound upon themselves, and they're going to be much worse much sooner than we expect.
After Inconvenient Truth, it was like the next week or something after it came out, was Katrina, and it never stopped since then, all these weird storms, big storms, and all that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really something. I mean, we really have gotten to a place in the world where we've done a lot of things that aren't so good to our planet. It seems like we really are ready to shift gears towards healing all that. Yeah. I guess I was thinking a little bit about this transition that we have made from this beautiful project that you do with kids to to the seriousness of what it means to have clean water and the necessity of protecting our water so that we have that.
Yeah.
And I guess I do have, since I was asking, what inspired your original interest and love for water, and what inspired your love for teaching about the watersheds, what kind of got you involved and concerned about water and maybe involved as a nuclear activist? I mean, that's kind of what I relate you as one of the first nuclear activists I met when I moved to Oregon.
Where I grew up was in the Berkshires, Massachusetts, was in civics class. We went on a field trip to Yankee Atomic, which has just been finally shut down. That's been another screwed up one. One of the very first nuclear power plants. In fact, done by Rickhofer, whatever his name was, Admiral, who did the nuclear submarines, he was onto some very good ways of doing nuclear stuff and trying to have it be very well done, but he kind of led our country into how to do nuclear power plants. And Yankee Atomic was one of his first ones up in Vermont and tucked in the back hills, which I was living right on the border of Vermont. So we went over there. So it was my local nuclear power plant. And I went in high school and it gave me the creeps. And they had one of those plates of the Fiesta ware in their little exhibit that was given out at gas stations with the glaze on it. It was done with uranium, and it made a really nice glaze, but they were radioactive dinner plates that were handed out at gas stations if you got a fill-up in the 50s or something like that. And they had one of those to show how a Geiger counter works. And I was like, and it all just stuck. And a few years later, I was back apprenticing to a graphic designer in that area. He lived near there, so I would go out to visit him, and I went out at night after visiting him, and I went back up to Yankee Atomic, and I was about 20 years old or something then, and I sat there at night, all night long, looking at it, and it was humming away, and it was being there, and it was thoroughly creeped me out. And from there on, I decided I'm going to be shutting them down. It was just gross. And so it was kind of a spiritual night I had that night, and it began things where I just didn't trust them. That's what was going on at that thing, that you can't trust them. And our civics teacher was trying to bring us there to show us this, and she was trying to be straight and say, this is Power for America, and this is our modern day thing. But there was a whole lot of hemming and hawing about stuff that people didn't understand and how dangerous it was. And 1986, see, that was 73, 72. 1986 was Chernobyl. So 13 years later, Chernobyl blew, and somewheres before that was 3 Mile Island, Harrisburg, that almost wiped out New York and Washington, D.C. and the whole megalopolis. It was just by luck, or God, or something or other, that the hydrogen bubble at the top of the thing didn't get a spark. If it had, it would have blown the top, just like Fukushima, of the container building, and all that radioactive stuff would have gone in an explosion, steam explosion into the air, into the megalopolis area. It's like 100 miles from New York City or something like that. But
it's downright scary. I mean, to live in that area, boy, that's a little bit of a wake-up call.
You'd think so.
You'd think.
But it didn't do it. And it didn't wake people up enough. Where people just live there and say, well, that happened, but it didn't happen. And so... But Chernobyl super did happen. Chernobyl was next, and Chernobyl blew, and it was like a mile into the air of a tower of fire shooting up from it when it had its meltdown, and people in the surrounding area were like, oh no. And then there was so much government cover-up of the petty bureaucrats who didn't want to get blamed for not reporting it fast, so they didn't report it at all, and luckily Gorbachev caught on that he was getting mixed reports of what's going on up there. And they said, everything's fine, and it was roaring into the air with radioactive particles shooting up into the air. And the Ural Mountains and whatever, that was the Ukraine, and it went all in the valley, up and down all around that area. And you can look at the picture of how far the radiation went that night, and into the river there, and down to the sea, actually, and past, blanking out on it, but big Russian city that was downriver. And again, it was this stupidness where they didn't want to dismay people on the celebration of the country was 4 days later, so they didn't tell them on May Day, or it was May 5th or something like that. They didn't tell them that a few days earlier radioactive cloud covered the city, and it's covering the city right now, and it's coming down on everyone. So all the people were out where they shouldn't have been out. They should have all been inside their houses for 2 weeks. They should not have gotten out. And they didn't tell them because they didn't want them to be non-patriotic. And so all kinds of people got it, and now all kinds of kids got cancer, got blood cancer, and leukemia. Tons of kids. Tons of children died.
Oh, sad.
Yeah.
And kids are the most susceptible to radioactive iodine in the environment, right? I mean...
Yeah.
It really
and there's
hurts
different
our
things.
kids.
There's strontium, and there's different things that go off and get stuck places, and some goes into your bones. But if any of the zingers get your, well, they do different things. Some go into your bones, and your bones are where you make blood in your bone marrow. So that gets to leukemia, and yeah.
So, I mean, you know what I was thinking when you were talking about that power plant that is now shut down in New York? I was thinking about one of the things I had learned about these power plants, that we just have all these power plants all over the world, and they are aging, seriously aging. And the companies that should be fixing them so that they can be, meet standards, like Hanford being one of those, right? It was built by a certain set of standards, and my understanding is that at this point they would say this nuclear generating station, the Columbia generating station, does not meet the specs for an earthquake, right? Is
Correct.
That what I understand? And that's kind of true of a lot of these old buildings, that they are built a long time ago. They're not really capable of withstanding the kind of disasters that could be in our near future.
Right. An interesting thing on our region is that when the pioneers moved in the 1850s and stuff, it seemed like it was much better than California because it didn't have earthquakes. But ours is building up to being the big one. And so the region seemed like perfect, and yet it's because it's going to have the big earthquakes. So things were built to what they understood for the seismic stuff in the 50s, in the 60s, and all that. And now they've gotten this from the sky kind of photographs that they take magnetic resonance of the iron in the planetary rock, and they can see much deeper, and they can go 10 miles down into what's going on down there. And underneath Hanford is 10 miles down is an enormous crack that could, according to the Seattle Times article, that it was discovered in the last 5 years, I guess I'd say, 6 years, that it could take the Cascadia subduction earthquake that's going to be a 9.0, and that supposedly will be muffled by the Cascades, that if you get into the Cascades or farther east, you will not have the effect of the huge earthquake. 9.0 is one of the biggest the planet has ever had, and it's going to be big, going from Arcata, California to Bellingham, Washington. And it'll take 15 minutes no matter where the crack starts, 15 minutes to go up and down each one of them. And anyways, it's big, and everybody's heard about it at this point. And so people laughed at me about 5 years ago or so when I was like, oh no, this huge earthquake is going to hit the coast, and Hanford will be destroyed, and it'll leak. And scientists and people laughed at me and said, no, you shouldn't be so worried. It's not going to go beyond the Cascades. Well, now they have a new technology, and now they see that there's this crack that's part of the plate tectonics of our continental shelf and our continent's plate. And it goes to Hanford right under it. And so when it happens, it will be translated under the Cascades. And a lot of the Cascades, you can live on the Cascades and you wouldn't feel the earthquake, but this could carry it over to Hanford and could break it up. So that's there.
That's pretty serious.
And we're like 100 years overdue for that earthquake. And besides that, there's earthquakes all the time that happen in that area. 3.5, 3.0. So things are getting rattled all the time. Radiation from when these power plants are being used, they are emitting this radiation that changes the makeup of the physical molecules of the steel and the pipes. And it brittles them. They become less flexible. It embrittles, or something they call it, the pipes. And so when an earthquake happens, they're not going to flex and boing and bump and sway. They're going to break. And they're going to be made of glass at that point. They're going to be very breakable.
Interesting. It reminds me of this idea they have to create a pipeline, apparently, for a certain amount of the movement of the radioactive waste to a different location in WIP.
And waste isolation pilot plant.
Right, and they're talking about creating a pipeline to move it like 15 miles. I mean, it seems like if that's the case, you're basically creating a pipeline that is going to become brittle and easily broken, maybe?
It could be. Maybe they'll make it out of some new material that has gotten this figured out.
I hope so. I would like to hope so, right?
That project is another one to be noted, which I just keep saying you can't trust these guys, the government, and yet it's supposed to be our government. But the waste isolation pilot plant in Carlsbad, New Mexico, when I was in 1978, I was living in Albuquerque, and I did graphics for Southwest Research and Information Center that is exposing the badnesses of the WIP site. So I did a breccia pipe picture that was used in a TV show, a news show about it. And that is, a breccia pipe is a geologic column of broken stone that falls down into a cavern that's created from underground water traveling and dissolving a cavern down below, and then all the weight of the stone above falls into it in broken material. About 5 miles from the waste isolation pilot plant a cattle rancher's pond fell in and disappeared one day, just boom, went down and gone, and all the water went out. And they said, whoa, dude. And this was where our government chose to experiment. I was only in my 20s, I think, back then, maybe 30 or something. Anyways, 30 years ago or something, the name Waste Isolation Pilot Plant. They were going to see if the salt beds that were in Carlsbad from the old sea of the old days that used to be there dried up, if the salt, which is so beautiful and even, could be a good place to excavate a tunnel and stick the nuclear waste. And it was a good idea, but back then I showed this breccia pipe that shows that it's not even, and also they found out that the heat of nuclear waste attracts water to it, like it draws it towards it. And so you get corrosion happening of the water comes, and then it will dissolve and fall, and when the rocks crack like that, when they fall in, there's transfer places between the horizontal layers of underground rock, and material starts moving. And so they threw a dye barrel into that hole of the breccia pipe that was right near the whip site, and it turned up in Mexico in a little village.
Whoa. Wow. That's wild.
It went under our border and down to Mexico.
Isn't that something? I mean, I guess that's really the bottom line and the real connection between what you do with talking about watersheds and the way watersheds work. I mean, the bottom line is that you can't put poison on the planet over here and not expect things to filter through and move around and affect things far and wide. I mean, that's why we live on, this is an ecosystem, right?
Yeah.
And that all these things are interconnected.
But people didn't know it in the old days. Like when I grew up, there was the dump, and you threw your crap in the dump, and it was a cool place with seagulls and fire. They'd burn it all the time. It stank. And you go throw your crap on the other crap, and nobody cared. But underneath those dumps that I grew up in the 50s was all the chemicals from the cans of all the crap mixing together, going down into the groundwater. And there'd be a bulldozer that would push it around and break up everything more and make it keep happening. But nobody was a bad guy. Everybody just had jobs.
And a lack of knowledge, So now we're kind of coming into a new era where we have a lot of technology to be able to see what's really going on, and a lot more experience to understand, the repercussions of all these things. But it didn't. Yeah, I agree completely.
I'd like to call that the Dark Ages. Right. From World War II, when we came up with so many pesticides and new chemical dyes, the coal tar dyes, and all kinds of, and the plastics, that came at that time. So 1940 on has been a ton of pollution. And we've been all gung-ho and excited as we design them and come up with them, some new see-through vinyl, yahoo! And different things that don't break in the coldness. And we're all so excited when we come up with new, titanium fake knees and all this other kind of new materials. It takes a little while to find out what the repercussions are of those, and I hope that now that we've gotten the new technologies, we've seen that we've made some mistakes, and I hope that we now are having the new generation that if we can hope to give them love and that love for each other, then they'll see to it that we won't make the blunders and the mistakes of our beginning being technologists from the 40s on, when we were just like ignorant and patriotic and didn't know what we were doing. It was so exciting. It was hard to imagine we'd ruin the planet so quickly. I'm ignorant. Fun.
Yeah. I mean, so I guess that kind of moves to kind of what I would love to focus on before we quit talking, which is if you're listening to all this information, and I mean, some of it is new to me, and I've been kind of in contact with this issue for a while and have learned things just tonight. So for people out there that are hearing this new information, what can they do with it? What can we do to make things better? What do you think?
I think we should look in our neighborhood and find in our neighborhood a issue to work on and hold every level of representatives that we have to be our champions. Like, use your county commissioners for the land. They should protect it. And if you have any issues, the land and the water is where you go with your local county commissioners. And you have them work for you, and you work with them, and let them get elected again by being the champions to protect us. Because there's been payola, greed, and people have been paid off, let's find the good people who we are electing, who will put these things in the open and not say it's for the scientists and the businessmen who pay the scientists and then give those reports to our government. We need to keep a whole bunch of transparency and have neighborhood research groups. There's such smarts in the high school kids, and we need high school groups that protect our neighborhood with a little community right to know process where you say, oh, really, Mr. Factory Man? You're making huge profits now. What are you puking into our neighborhood? What's coming out your smokestack, and what's coming out the pipe down into the water? And what are you dumping in that pond? And is that pond lined? That's seeping out into the river right next to the pond? That's like a typical industrial problem where they think they're doing good by dumping these dreadful mixtures of chemicals into ponds next to the factories, and it leaks out and goes down into the watershed.
Yeah. You know, talking about our representatives, it reminds me of something that I think that is very cool that came after the Bernie Sanders defeat. After we lost our opportunity to have Bernie Sanders as our president, he moved some of his energy into the Our Revolution movement. And with that movement, one of their main campaigns is for us to stand up and be a part of this legislative system, and for individuals that care to actually run for these offices, and for us to kind of get more and more of the people back into the picture, because it seems like we've created some sort of separation where a lot of the people that represented us are living such a different lifestyle. They don't even recognize or understand the real problems that a lot of the rest of the country are experiencing. You know, like, I mean, if you make it so that your representatives have a completely different healthcare system than everybody else, well, it's not surprising that they don't write on cue when it comes to, we need to fix the healthcare system, right? And I feel the same way, I guess, about all these things, you know, as far as it's so important for us to communicate to our representatives. It's also very important for us to become representatives. So
I like that.
Right?
So a lot of people think they don't have the training for it, but I mean, God, we had Ronald Reagan for president. You've got to be able to do better than that. I mean, actors and stuff to be presidents? No.
That was the craziest thing. And I was a kid when that happened. And I thought, well, these people out of their mind. I thought he was paid to trick us into thinking he's different than he is.
Yeah, so I know that a lot of people don't think that they are the ones to be like the eWeb Board of Commissioners. How about that? The electric. Every one of our rural electric cooperatives could use some people on the board. Lane Electric, what are the other ones around here? EPUD and eWeb.
eWeb, yeah.
What are these groups? They're called public utilities oftentimes, yet there seems to be a little inner sanctum of businessmen that are making decisions. Let's really keep these things alive with people who report back to their community the decisions that are being made. Like eWeb owns windmills off in Utah, I think it is. And the electricity comes back this way. Someplace, I know I drove by them, and all of a sudden I saw a sign that said it was eWeb's windmills, and it was the strangest thing off of 84. And so they make decisions that, like, did you know that these rural electric cooperatives own Hanford's Columbia Generating Station that is run by Energy Northwest, a public utility? It's because the biggest one in our area is Bonneville Power, which is called a public utility, but they're like run for us by the government, and how do you get at them to having representation to say, shut the Columbia Generating Station, they're hiding, and yet what happens when it blows and has an accident? They're going to dump all the expense of it back through it onto all these little teeny rural electric cooperatives who don't have any clue that they actually have a say at Hanford on what goes on. And they just change the names of it, and people don't even know that the Columbia Generating Station is operating at Hanford. Most people don't know there's still anything going on at Hanford.
Yeah, I mean, and when it comes to the cleanup, it was interesting when we went up there and we were interviewing people, and apparently Washington voters actually voted and said, what you have done at Hanford needs to be cleaned up, and you need to clean it up. And when we went up there, of course, that was a long time ago, over 10 years ago, but the word was that they were fighting that in court based on a constitutional basis. According to the Constitution, they felt that they somehow shouldn't have to clean it up. And people in the state, when we interviewed them, they were like, oh, we voted about that, and they've cleaned that up already. That's all taken care of. And then we found out that, oh, well, actually, they're in court saying that they have a constitutional right not to clean it up. So I thought that was really interesting about that whole process.
And they changed the names of things and stuff. Okay, so we don't know about that, but farther up in our same Columbia Snake River watershed, which reaches thousands of miles inland to the Rocky Mountains at Yellowstone. So a little river comes off of Yellowstone caldera, or the Yellowstone National Park, the volcano that is bulging, that could be a really big one. Well, only an hour and a half drive from there in Rexburg, Idaho, along in a stream going down into Idaho Falls, I believe it is INEL, Idaho National Laboratory. It used to be called Idaho National Nuclear Laboratory, and it's changed around a lot, but it's generally called INEL, and it's got about 7 nuclear power plants operating, and I don't see any streams there, so it's all being used with the Bitterroot Mountains water that goes underground, pouring out in Idaho Falls into the Snake River. This whole nuclear research laboratory right now is way more active than Hanford in current things. Stuff that OSU has come up with, these mini nukes that are modular, that's being tested this year. They're creating one right there. They're doing lots of stuff. And you go there, and it's like 36 square miles or something. I can't remember what they said, but you can't get in or see or go to anything. They have chain link fences, and it's all separated. It's part of the Navy and military. It's government secrets. And yet, it could kill us. Any one of those nukes could have a meltdown. And if that Yellowstone volcano blows, there are going to be huge earthquakes in that area. And there's 6, 7 nukes in our Columbia River watershed right there. And what's this with military sites polluting so much? This is our military. If they want us to be proud, thanks for serving up nuclear waste. You know, we've got to have it be that the people aren't fighting the military, but that we're all in this together. If we're so high-tech with our weapons and our jazzy stuff, we should be high-tech with cleaning up the military sites. Hanford, right. And there are military sites, and INEL.
And with taking care of these reactors that are dilapidating, and my understanding is that General Electric has a big part of that, and that they basically are not spending their money to take care of them. So they're just kind of letting them become more and more dilapidated and more a risk of lack of containment if you're not keeping upkeep on these things. It seems like.
Yeah, and the creepy thing is, it's who's president of the United States is whether they're going to clean it up. That's like Trump doesn't care. Okay, so it's not going to get cleaned up while he's there. But 10 years ago or something, the word was that $2 billion a year goes to Hanford to the cleanup of that nuclear waste, and that goes to Bechtel, the old companies. Westinghouse, General Electric, all those guys are in on it, and they have offices and laboratories and tons of people having jobs and McMansions next to each other on the hills of Richland and Kennewick and the Tri-Cities area, there's a lot of people who have jobs, and they just keep this issue going and going and going. They never fully clean it up because their job is to work on cleaning it up. So they never want to clean it up because then their job will be over with.
Right. It just reminds me, when I went to school learning how to work on cars, they made it very clear that the incentive for a company is its bottom line. It's how much money it can make. If they can save money by not caring about a piece of the earth here, or not having to deal with cleaning up the river that they've contaminated over here, then it's more profit for the company. And that's the way capitalism works, right? The bottom line is, if it's cheaper for the company, it's better for the company. And that's the philosophy that's behind all of this.
Yeah, saving money, all these different ways, so they don't have to pay tax. There's no part of the capitalist setup where they get rewarded for cleaning up. It's always trying to figure out how to get out of the cleaning up that the companies are in.
Yeah.
So therefore we need the legislators to make incentives and laws that they get huge fines. Like, so often the fines are so small that it's cheaper to just pollute and pay the fine.
Exactly. I mean,
over and over again.
I mean, this show is Water is Life in honor of the movement that started at the Dakota Access Pipeline. And one of the biggest things that happened that I was so shocked about during the end days was that when they were told, you cannot continue on this project, your deal is suspended, and they actually continued to drill and continued to lay the pipeline, and basically had in their budget the $50,000 a day to pay the fine, and could care less because they just pay that $50,000 a day and just keep doing what they're doing.
Yeah, they get their pencil and they go, oh, we can do this.
You were talking about the electric companies and the different co-ops that are actually really. I mean, I have Blatchley Lane Electric.
Yeah.
It's tiny. It's tiny. Yeah. I mean, basically, if they were responsible for dealing with what is really going on up there when it came down to an emergency situation, I think that everybody would just go bankrupt and there'd be nothing they could really do about it. I mean, I don't think they have the kind of money that would clean up that mess.
Yeah, and innocent, sweet people get on the boards of these things, and it's a nice way to volunteer your time in your community. And those people really are not prepared to make decisions about the nuclear issues that are so scary. And I went to talk to the guy over at Lane Electric Co-op as I was living in Oak Ridge, and that's our electric company for there. And there's a fellow there who was all excited about it, and then he realized I was not excited about nuclear. But he'd gone to meetings, and he was part of the board, and he ended up being, I believe, working up there for Bonneville Power and working for Energy Northwest, the company that runs the Columbia Generating Station. So here he was, here in Eugene, and glad that the people didn't know about it. And like, I was the first person to bring it up. Yet he made a job for himself and continued in that world. So he kept this sweet little relationship of this consortium of rural electric cooperatives going amongst somehow businessmen who know what's going on, but these other people on the board don't even know about it.
Well, yeah, I would imagine. I mean, if I were to get on the board of my local electric co-op, I probably wouldn't necessarily know thoroughly all the information about nuclear necessarily, right? I mean, it's probably completely foreign concept that isn't even part of what you understand. And you learn more being a part of that board than you ever even had any idea what I mean, I just happen to know that we get 7% of our electricity from the Columbia Generating Station. Mm-hmm. I mean, and I only know that because of a couple protests that we've done over there at eWeb saying, hey, why don't you consider different choices and get rid of that 7% nuclear?
And you know what? You can ask them, and it'll vary between 2% and 7%.
Oh, that's funny because it seemed like it was all very clear back in the day when we talked about it, that it was 7.
And I was glad when they told me 2%. Then I went and asked a different person, and it bops up again to 5%. So it's all a bunch of
What is the real, I mean, what do they call that? Fake information, right? You just never know what you're really getting these days.
And also, people who play with statistics know how to couch it in the right way. You could say 2% of the Northwest's power, or you could say 7% of Eugene's power, or Oregon's power.
Right.
You could go different ways on that.
And so you just come up with a number that seems smaller. But I mean, the bottom line really with that is the idea that we could make some different choices on how we're creating power. eWeb, for instance, with its wind power, is already making some of those different choices. So if we were putting our energy into shutting down things like the Columbia River Generating Station so that we don't have to risk the lives of humans and every creature living in our ecosystem here, we could put that same money and energy into some new technologies that are better.
Decentralize and make local energy and stop having these humongous, dangerous, big projects. Big dams that can break. Big nuclear power plants that are way beyond the understanding of a local mechanic. Why don't we have local mechanics making windmills and water wheels like we did in 1910?
Right, that's funny because it reminds me when we went up there and I testified at that hearing in Hanford. It was during a time period that they were considering a thing called GNEP, the Global Nuclear Energy Project. And as partnership. Oh, yes, thank you. Global Nuclear Energy Partnership. And I was totally beyond horrified when I got the 5-inch tall book in the mail that explained.
Good to put the grandchildren on at the dinner table.
Right. It explained what the idea was. And the idea was to get nuclear waste from around the entire planet, bring it to our country, and recycle it.
Yeah.
And what was really interesting about it was they made it very clear that they didn't even really have the recycling process figured out, that it was all kind of an experimental idea. And the idea of bringing all this nuclear waste from, moving it across the planet, which has enough of its own risk.
With storms at sea, I mean, how are they going to move it? Fly it and crash the plane?
And that they would be doing that from all over the world and bringing it to our country. I was just like, you're kidding me. And then, and we went to this hearing and there was all of these incredibly smart people, this amazing scientists and just, and so much talk and all this testimony that a lot of it was even, clean above my head. And I hardly knew what to say. And when it was my turn to speak, I'll never forget what I did say because it really summarized what I felt then and I still feel very strongly about, which is with all of these amazing, smart individuals involved with this and all the incredible technology and ability that we have to do incredible things on the planet, is this really the best idea we can come up with? I believe that we have the ability to do things better at this point. Yeah. And I feel like our planet is ready for that. I really feel like we as a people, and not just talking about our nation, we as a people, human people all over the world, people are standing up and saying, wait a second, this is not really going the way we feel like it should if we want our children to have a future, if we want our planet to be here with water to drink and sustain us and our kids and our kids' kids, those 7 generations. Yeah, well, I feel like we probably should wrap this up. We could probably talk all night, but
we sure could.
There's a lot to say, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm just so extremely thankful to have you come on my show, and I'm extremely thankful for the seeds that you laid inside of me so many years ago that were the places that I can point at as the roots for where I became inspired to care so much and want to start this show, among other things.
Sweet.
So, thank you.